The longest day of the year has relevance in many pagan and heathen calendars, and we find it nestled between the two shortest nights of the year. But more importantly, it was perceived that on this day that the sun stopped moving. The name solstice comes to us from the Latin solstitium, which means the sun stands still. And for all of our ancestors who watched the heavens, this was not just a saying, a throwaway line. These people watched the heavens carefully, paying attention to the changes, and so they observed that as the summer progressed, the sun's journey going up high and across the sky would halt, pause, and then turn into its journey towards the cold and dark of winter. To people who considered the sun as having sacred power, this moment when the sun was at its peak, showing its greatest strength, was also the very moment its power began to wane, the moment the darkness of the nights, begin to get longer, and so slowly reclaim these days. This paradox was not lost to those thousands of years ago, as they depended on the cycle of the sun, and these moments, whilst celebrated, this would have probably also caused deep anxiety amongst the tribes and the settlers there. So the rituals and the festivals that we imagined happened to celebrate this event, they were also a response to this cosmic situation to ensure the sun did not stop in the sky. And so in this short video, I'm going to tell you about why this moment of the sun showing strength was also a moment of deep worry for our ancestors, a time of magic and fire, of megalithic structures built to watch the sun, and of myths that tell of kings who will die, even on the brightest day of the year. And so grab yourself a cool drink on this summer's day, and welcome to Crackenfold. Before we can understand the myths about the summer solstice, I will just explain a little about it. You see, the summer solstice is not a full day, but rather it's the exact moment in time when the northern hemisphere's tilt towards the sun is at its absolute maximum. At this instant, the sun's rays are striking the Tropic of Cancer at a direct 90-degree angle, and so for those in the northern hemisphere, the sun appears at its highest point in the sky, which in turn gives us the longest period of daylight, with some areas experiencing well over 16 hours of sunlight. Now, you might also be asking yourself, if this is the day we receive the most sunlight, then why isn't it the hottest day of the year? And the reason for this is a phenomenon that is sometimes called the lag of the seasons. You have to think that the sun is like a heater for our planet, and after a long cold winter, it takes a significant amount of time and energy to warm up the vast oceans and the atmosphere that cover the world. So even though the sun's power begins to technically decrease after the solstice, the planet continues to absorb more heat than it radiates for several weeks or even a month or two, meaning the peak temperatures of summer often arrive later in July or even August. Now, even though this time of year is also known as Midsummer, technically that also arrives a few days later after the solstice, certainly in Northern Europe. Now, understanding the science allows us to understand the name solstitium, the sun standing still, as this is because for a couple of days before and after the solstice, the sun's noontime position in the sky seems to change very little, like as it stopped in its journey. And this perception of a celestial pause is the foundation on which mythology and the festivals and the rituals of summer solstice are built. The most understood importance of the summer solstice for those across Europe and the Middle East was agricultural. The Neolithic farming cultures of Northern and Central Europe were particularly affected by this, as their lives were governed by the cycle of the seasons, and this event was a definitive marker in the calendar. It allowed farmers to determine the correct times of planting and harvesting crops, which was for them, literally a matter of life and death. And understanding the symbolism of the sun stopping and its importance to those reliant on it, we can understand how traditions were built around it all across Europe and, say, into the Near East. Particularly, we see bonfires and sun wheels, symbolism used to give the sun energy to encourage it not to stop in the sky. And these fires were lit often on the highest areas of land, the hilltops, to be close to the sun. And so it's felt that the warmth of the fires would boost the sun's strength, to give it the power to continue to shine, to help the harvest in the coming months. This ritual could be described as sympathetic magic, giving more material back to an object, and for the Indo-Europeans at least, this reflects everything they knew about order and chaos and sacrificing material to keep the cosmos balanced. So we also see a ritual where young men would then leap over the fires, a practice that we believed was to bring purification and good luck. And in some traditions, the height of their jump was thought to predict the height to which the crops would then grow. And we also see another ritual with a sun wheel, where it was set alight, as it was often stuffed with dry grass or straw, and then it was rolled down a hill, normally towards a river or lake, a body of water, because you don't want a rolling fire going into the local village, and that would be like... Anyway, so it was rolled down a hill towards a river or lake, and this was a reenactment of the sun's journey, a piece of what we would call communal magic designed to ensure the sun's cycle continued. But these rituals were not limited to Northern Europe. In Rome, we have a festival for Vesta called Vestalia, who was the goddess of the hearth and the home, and this involved married women bringing offerings to her temple, although this was slightly before the solstice, and the ancient Greeks celebrated Chronia for Kronos. It's a harvest festival honouring the god Kronos, and that was slightly after the solstice. And in that festival, the social hierarchy was suspended for a day and slaves feasted alongside their masters. And it's easy to imagine these festivals as being fun and joyous events, but they were necessary because underneath there would have been a really deep-seated anxiety. The sun needed to be boosted, and such a thought reveals a concern about the future. These rituals must have been cathartic in nature, and by participating in rituals such as leaping through flames or rolling sun wheels, one was providing direct input into the ritual, giving a sense of agency to an otherwise cosmic force. Now, one piece, or perhaps it's better to say many pieces of evidence to show the sacredness of the solstice, and this evidence has an enduring presence across the landscape where these rituals took place, is to look at the great stone monuments that were erected, the megaliths, the most iconic of which is Stonehenge, where each year thousands gather to watch the summer solstice sun rise majestically. Often dressed as druids, they show that there is still much misunderstood about Stonehenge, solstice and druids. But one thing is for sure, the people who built these monuments went out of their way to ensure they were accurate and showed the solstice, with many stones deliberately polished or shaped to allow the sun to shine past them at exactly the right time. However, just as the solstice represents the sun's strength and its weakness, there's also a duality to Stonehenge. For many go there in the summer, but it's probably more likely that it was built predominantly, and I'll talk about that here, for the winter solstice, because the longest nights meant that you were closest to the other world. And that brought with it many stories of myth and legend. And this doesn't mean that a summer solstice alignment was unimportant. Such a massive, labour-intensive undertaking to build these structures were done because there was focus on these structures all year round. It was just that certain days were far more important, and to me the winter solstice was a far more sacred time than the summer solstice. And Stonehenge is not unique in this fact. Across the British Isles, Ireland, Europe, and into the Near East, we see evidence of the solstice being recognised within many stone monuments. Now, to those of you who are new to my work, then I'll let you know that this is a mythology channel. And to truly grasp the meaning of summer solstice, we should look into the world of myth to see what stories and messages it can provide us. One story that reflects the summer solstice is the myth of the Oak King and the Holly King, a story from British folklore. In a time when the year was divided into two halves, each ruled by a king. The Oak King, the lord of the waxing light, reigns from the winter solstice to the summer solstice, and so looks across the kingdom as the days grow longer and the world turns green. The Holly King is the lord of the waning light, and who rules from the summer solstice to the winter solstice as the days shorten and the cold sets in. And it is on the day of the summer solstice that the two kings must meet in a ritual battle. At the summer solstice, the Holly King is at the peak of his power and so defeats the Oak King, allowing their Holly King to begin his reign, guiding the sun on its downward path. And this event is then reversed 6 months later. This story is an excellent allegorical representation of the astronomical reality of the solstice. And there are other similar stories across the British Isles. We also see a reflection of this in Christianity, where the feast of the Nativity of St. John the Baptist, celebrated on June the 24th, and so at the time of Midsomer, it has John the Baptist speaking of the coming of Jesus, and he says, "He must increase, but I must decrease." This is an ancient story of a waning power at the moment of greatest light, but dressed in a new religious language, but with its mythological mythings remaining intact. And speaking of Midsummer, an event so close to the solstice, we should really touch on it. We see in Shakespeare's A Midsummer's Night's Dream, the fairy world is colliding with the human world, and it causes confusion and misdirected love. And the belief around this was not confined to the British Isles. We see in Nordic folklore, Midsummer's Eve was a time of profound enchantment, when it was said that cows could gain the power of speech, seals could shed their skins and become human for a time, and elves might appear at crossroads to offer you riches, an offer that, if you accepted, it was almost certainly to result in your disappearance from this world. Now, these celebrations of Midsummer were of a world full of magical forces. Rituals of protection were required, and divination became essential. Crowns of flowers and protective herbs were needed to ward off malevolent spirits. And one tradition had it that if an innocent woman secretly picked 7 different types of flowers on Midsummer's Eve and placed them under her pillow, she would dream of the person she was destined to marry. These elements of Midsummer, the fires, the feasting, magic and, let's call it social interaction, are shared across Northern Europe, but each culture has developed its own traditions, as you would expect. But we also have to note that Midsummer and Solstice are different traditions, have different origins, with Midsummer being a fixed date and Solstice obliged to, wander wherever the heavens take it. And perhaps part of this is the result of switching between calendar types, the Gregorian and Julian calendars, but this should not take away from the importance of the festivals for those who celebrate them. And so, where does that leave us? Well, first, if you want to understand more about mythology, then feel free to use the Mythology and Folklore database. It's a service that is provided with the help of my patrons and YouTube members, and please consider joining one of these if you like my content and want to support it and the research I continue to produce. And so a big thank you to all of you who do support me. But as a conclusion, then we can, see that the summer solstice is not just a party on the longest day of the year. It is about strengthening the sun, the concern over the future welfare of our families if they cannot eat, and this was so important that humans built huge monuments to remember this. For me, well, the summer solstice is a reminder that despite the light, the world is always transitioning, the turning of the wheel, so to speak. But importantly, it is a time for communities to come together, to feast, to sing, to dance and, well, to look after each other. And so, well, take a moment to stand outside and in the sunshine and feel the light and the heat, knowing that there's a shadow being cast behind you and that the cycle of light and dark exists. And that, well, there is a beauty and a wisdom that all of our ancestors knew in their very bones about the cosmos that surrounds us. Take care.